Now we're going to talk about how do we ensure that we tell the right story at the right time for the right reasons. Now remember where we are in the entrepreneurial selling process. Stories are a tool of influence. They may be your most powerful tool of influence. And stories are a tool that you use wherever you may be in the entrepreneurial selling process, whether it's back in early in the execution phase where you're doing lead generation and qualifying, or whether you're forward in the analysis phase where you're helping clients fall in love with you. This is a tool you can always use. Two things to talk about here. The first question is, if we understand that stories are at least twice as powerful as facts in helping influence people's decisions, then what kinds of stories should we be telling? What are the types of stories? In my book called What's Your Story, I look at 4 types of stories that we as leaders, entrepreneurs, salespeople should be telling. Success stories, failure stories, fun stories, and legends. And I think 3 of those definitions, 3 of those types are pretty obvious. Success, failure, and fun. We all tell those stories all the time. Legends are slightly different. Legends have a 2-part definition. If I tell you a story anywhere in the world about Steve Jobs, many people know who Steve Jobs is. He's a legend. He's a business legend. Or anywhere in the world, if I tell you a story about Gandhi, he's a cultural, historical figure. He's a legend, right? Those are 2 different types of legends. So there's the historical, religious, spiritual, cultural teaching stories, and then there's also business stories, so business legends. But there's really 4 types of stories. And the question I like to ask of all of us is, what are the relative advantages and disadvantages of each type of story? Think about success. Let's just start left to right. Let's start with success stories. What do you get from success stories? When you tell a customer, a potential employee, a success stories are inspirational, they're aspirational, they show me the way. You tell me a success story, it shows me the way. But like any tool, and any tool we've talked about in this course, you have to be careful. Any tool in business you can overuse. If I tell you too many success stories, here's the dark side of success stories. I can become arrogant or egotistical, right? And I can rub you the wrong way. So you have to be careful with these combination of stories, and that's why we talk about telling all 4 types of stories in combination. But success stories are very powerful. You just have to avoid the dark side. Failure. What about failure stories? Some of you may be looking at this thinking, wait a minute, I'm going to tell a story about how I failed? You bet. Failure stories are packed with learning. Research suggests that human beings learn more from failure than we learn from any other type of experience. We learn a ton from failure. So they're packed with lessons learned. For salespeople and for entrepreneurs, there's another piece of DNA, genetic code, that failure stories carry that I just love. Humility. If a failure story is genuine and authentic, the act of me telling you a failure story is an act of humility. I'm just saying, hey, I made a couple of really bad decisions, it didn't go my way, and it blew up in my face, and that's a failure story. It doesn't mean that you think I'm a moron. It just means that I'm sharing with you an experience I had, and it didn't work out for me. Very, very powerful. Now, just like success stories have a dark side, so do failure stories. If you tell too many failure stories, you can damage your credibility, right? Or you tell a failure story in a group of people who are already down, you could take their energy even lower. So you have to be careful with this type of story. Let's talk about fun. Fun is maybe the most obvious kind of story, and you've all told a fun story. Fun stories lighten the mood. They lower the intensity. They just give people a break. They're so powerful in that way. And of course, like successes and failures, they have a dark side of their own. If I tell you too many fun stories in a row, I become an entertainer. I don't want to be an entertainer. I want to be an educator, right? So it can go bad on me. I can tell you too many fun stories, and then it will rub you the wrong way. And then finally, legends. Legends are incredibly powerful. In fact, one of the things that gives them an advantage is they often encompass the other 3 types of stories. So a legend is often a meandering story where it has some elements of success, it might have funny parts in it, and it has failure in it, and it's got a very long arc to it. It's a legend. Therein lies the disadvantage of a legend story too. So a legend advantage is there's lots of moving parts, there's a lot to see, there's a lot of context, often a lot of emotion. The problem with a legend story is the same. Because there's so much of that, if I told you a legend story right now, it would ask a lot of you to come with me It would ask all of you to come with me on this journey, and some of you I might lose in the process of unspooling that long story. So all of these 4 types have their relative advantages and disadvantages. We know from research that these stories are more powerful than any other forms of information, so we've got to collect these stories. Now, let's talk about a tool, a framework by which we can collect these stories. I call this your story matrix. It's the simplest tool. It's simply a grid, a spreadsheet, call it what you want, rows and columns, and it's very simple to describe. This, for me, is the quiver of arrows on your back. This is what we work with entrepreneurs and salespeople to develop, to capture that palette, that quiver of stories. On the columns, you've got, of course, the 4 types. You've got success stories in the first column, failures, then fun, then legends. The rows are the places where you need stories. If you're an entrepreneur starting a small service business in your neighborhood, you might need stories about customer service. You would have a row on customer service. You might have a row about your fantastic people, and you've got stories, successes, and failures about your people. You've got your pricing or value proposition. You've got all your different rows. And the way you use this story matrix is as you go through the world and you collect stories, you add them to the different cells on your story matrix. Now, let's say that I'm working with a bunch of salespeople and I'm talking about the value of preparation. We all know one of the things that is critical to successful sales is preparing for these meetings. Well, I know that. It's a fact. We know that better prepared people perform better in meetings. But that's a fact. That doesn't do much for you. You know why? Because you can't feel it. But what if I walk into a room with you and I say, you know what, folks, here's what we know from research. You've got to be prepared. Better prepared people are more successful in meetings. 20 years ago, when I was selling computer systems, I was walking into a business, and I walked into a company without knowing what they did. They were called a drop forge. They were a manufacturing company, and they were a type of manufacturer called a drop forge. And I walked in, I was all dressed up, ready to sell, and I called on the president of the company, and he actually met with me, and we went into the conference room and we sat down. And I started talking, I started selling. And about 12 or 13 minutes into the meeting, I discovered what a drop forge does. In this case, it was the type of forge, the company produced metal golf club heads. And they did it through a form of manufacturing called a drop forge, where a large piece of steel, about 40 tons, drops 4 stories and lands on these raw metal pieces, and through sheer force punches out golf club heads. Well, I didn't know that, and I certainly didn't know that the forge was about 35 feet through the wall that I couldn't see. And about 12 or 13 minutes into my sale, that thing dropped on its routine that it did every day, and it dropped and it stamped out these series of metal golf club heads. And I am here to tell you, when a 40-ton piece of equipment drops a few stories and lands abruptly, it makes a tremendous noise. So I'm selling and I'm just doing my thing, and 12 minutes in, this thing just goes wham! And I jumped up out of my seat, and the guy was sitting there looking at me, and I thought we were under attack, and I said, "What was that?" And he said, "Son, you don't know what a drop forge is, do you?" And I said, "No." And the question for you watching this video is, what do you think happened next? He kicked me out of the building because I was unprepared. I had no idea what a drop forge does. If I would have done 5 minutes worth of preparation, that drop forge wouldn't have surprised me, because I would have known what they were manufacturing and how they were doing it. It would have taken me 5 minutes. But I didn't do my homework. And I just thought, I don't need to know what they do. I'll walk in and sell my stuff. That is the value of preparation. Now think about this for a second. I can tell you to be prepared. It's a fact. I can show you the research. You can't feel that. Hopefully, my drop forge story, you can feel the surprise and the fear that I had when that thing went off. And the moral to that story is, I've got to be prepared. These are 2 different forms of information. They're both influential, but it turns out the story is much more powerful. The story matrix will help you capture those. So the drop forge story is a personal failure that comes in the situation where I need to talk about preparation, and that's where it lives on my story matrix. As you move through this, as you move through your day and your week and your month, be aware of the stories that are all around you, get them down, distill them, and put them on your story matrix. And that is where power and influence live.